Good morning, I'm Jeff, and this is going to be a long video, at least probably the longest that I have recorded. And it's going to discuss my awakening. I first became awakened probably a couple of years ago, but then I went through some issues and was in stasis for a bit. And then I got introduced to Paths of Glory, which I do have videos on. World War I strategic board game, and how this has anything to do with awakening only became apparent to me actually long after I had first started playing this game. And part of it is that it was a way in which that the translation could occur. And that is something that I remember when I was attending University of Maryland way back as an undergrad during orientation. One of the professors said that going to school is about learning different languages. And part of learning languages is learning how to translate. Anyway, part of my soul's journey, probably for the last few thousand years, has been kind of warrior-oriented. We'll discuss that later. Anyway, Paths of Glory, what is so significant about it is that about the design of the game World War I, and also there was an accompanying podcast that I was introduced to. This was probably more significant. It was Blueprint for Armageddon. Forgot exactly who says it, but who speaks it, but just Google Blueprint for Armageddon. It's about 2 to 3 hour episodes. It's really in depth. But it really highlights a few things. One is that World War I was the first time at which that humanity had to face Fermi's paradox, and that why wasn't there advanced civilization so obviously out there? And unless the civilization reaches, or a society or a species reaches, a true balance, they're going to wipe themselves out. And the other issue is that something that I brought up probably in a blog back in January. Different names for the same thing is the translation, but just put that into Google. I think it was January 21st. And on my blog, it has a picture of Caesar crossing the Rubicon. Anyway, what was I going to say? It's like I had referred to This American Life episode where people talk about having time travel skill and being able to kill Hitler or his parents. And for World War I, most people probably haven't heard or forgotten who directly caused World War I. Gagliano Princip. He was just some 20-year-old Serb, just some kid who got into Serbian intelligence or was associated, maybe drinking buddies or something. Anyway, he happenstance, the Archduke, his motorcade made a wrong turn, even though they knew that there was assassins out there. They had arrested many of them, the ones that didn't kill themselves in the river. Anyway, it's like he had a pistol ready and he shot and killed him, and everything went down from there. So the Serbs regard him as a national hero, even though probably many Serbians in the 20th century have died, but at least they have a country, so to speak. And anyway, probably Gagliano probably is like, what the fuck happened? Anyway, but also World War I was the first time where, there was just the winners or the countries that had emerged from World War I without being dismembered were the ones that had, a fossil fuel economy. They were able to give their people those toys needed to dilute themselves. And so it's manifested in Paths of Glory with any of the armies that have a loss factor of 3. And they're rest of the armies have a loss factor of 2. That depends on whether or not they have a fossil fuel economy. But also is the beginning of the systematic poisoning of our environment. That had all, your simple Roundup or certainly crossbow, herbicides. Yeah, that had its start in World War I. The German Empire, they were stuck. They were landlocked. They couldn't get any more nitrates from Chile. And so, as inventive as they are, they made their own. Anyway, they discovered that chemical agents in small doses, they can also do a lot of, they can kill different plants, insects. Nerve agents are insecticides. Wasp spray is actually is a nerve agent. You get it at Home Depot, Fred Meyer. Use it to defend yourself. And anyway, so what would happen if we didn't go through this winnowing process that we're going through right now? And there's actually a series. It's going to just the pressure's going to keep building up. And it's the Expanse TV series. It's for what, I just started watching it. I don't really watch live TV, but so I'm reading the books first, and then I'll just probably watch an episode here and there. Anyway, so I don't know the background story, but my guess is that, we've made it through this process, but not all the karmic debts have not been settled. And so, we've bringing the war out, where it looks like, Mars is the militaristic entity, which kind of makes sense. And then Earth is still, they're the elite area, where people can be blind to what the damage that they're doing. And then the asteroid belt is where all the workers are working, and that's where the battlefield is occurring. So anyway, so another thing about this podcast, so all that stuff, I could have inferred from the game, but the podcast had some really interesting issues in there. One was especially the Russian Revolution. So the Russian Revolution, as Americans, we don't really, that's where the communists took over, end of story. That's where the first critical mass riot occurred. St. Petersburg, March 8th, 1917. Look it up. They blocked the lane, the Cossacks did. And then, so World War I led to World War II. And, probably, the darkest time in human history occurred in the Dark Valley. Again, as Americans, we're kind of a nerd to this kind of thing. World War II, massive sacrifice. United States, we lost almost 500,000 men. And I say men because it was almost virtually no civilian casualties. And a lot of people say, well, Russia, they fought the Nazis, they fought a land war. They won, though. Russia in 1939 had just under 200 million people. They lost, 8 million military casualties, 8 million deaths, 13 million civilian casualties. Over 10% of the population. The Russian people, there was no one that was immune to this. No families lost, no one. As far as, like my direct descendants, I had a few, like great uncles or something that might have served, but nobody died. Nobody, as far as I know, got wounded. Again, this is, it's kind of a clue to my etheric DNA as opposed to my physical DNA. But anyway, the trauma that the Russian people suffered, was immense, and it isn't really properly annotated very well. People just think that, I hope that didn't stop. I'm new at this anyway. The screen went out, so I have to keep adjusting it. A lot of people, they think, okay, the Battle of Berlin, where the Red Army had surrounded Berlin, and most of the civilian population, they were deluded into thinking that the war was, as long as Goebbels was still alive, they believed that they were winning, that there were super weapons imminent on the horizon. So they didn't leave the city. And there's a lot of talk about what the Red Army did. Anyway, comparison to what the Russian people suffered, the Red Army exercised restraint. And I'll leave it at that. So after World War II, of course, and I've said that I was going to get into Twilight Struggle. And Twilight Struggle actually does have a lot to do with what I'm going to be writing about, or recording videos. And again, please forgive me. I am trying to, actually I'm having a lot of fun with this, but it means that I'm not going to do a lot of extensive editing and all that. Anyway, Twilight Struggle as a game and as a Cold War replication, it exemplifies the delusion of control. And it isn't just, something, just linear, but friends and enemies, all stakeholders had to believe that their friends and even their enemies, that they had absolute power over, the nuclear arsenal. But there was a 2014 article in the New Yorker that actually turned Dr. Strangelove, a dark comedy, actually into a very disturbing disturbing documentary that, anybody that was kind of like that controlled a squadron of bombers, they had the ability to launch nuclear Armageddon. And it was probably pretty much the Americans on this side. The Russians, as much as we tried to vilify them, their story was of World War II, and even though they won, they endured massive trauma, and they would rather lose than to have to go through that again. And so that really informs as to why Kennedy had the power that he had to be able to threaten, like, hey, like, no missiles in Cuba, I don't care. You got to turn them back or else we're going to nuke you. The Russians were not ready. They did not expect to be able to use, or they expect to use their nuclear arsenal. So it's definitely, more of a mind game. So, I'm not going to be neglecting that. There's going to be probably 3 videos on that particular codependent relationship. So now we're getting into probably more current times, and I probably so something started spinning inside of me, probably about the Galactic Tide and the Oort Cloud. And the Oort Cloud is this cloud where all the comets come from that's around the sun. It's about 2 light years away. But I got to thinking that the sun is an average star, so all stars have an Oort cloud. And so it's really this kind of soap bubble formation that spins around the Milky Way's central black hole. And so you have this, and at which at any point it's just like a soap bubble formation that, there's just like complete absence of entropy at this point, that if you can call upon any particle that's there, that's at the sun's Oort cloud, and it could be instantly across the galaxy. Anyway, it's just something that I was just kind of not really thinking that much about, but then I became wide awake to the solar wind. It was translated to my blog post on April 1st, 2017, as Wide Awake to the Silken Wind. I mean, that's how things work, is that, you know, you receive the untranslated or the partially translated statement, and then later on you figure out what it really means. And April 1st, the start of the second quarter of this year, and, you know, I realized that the overall theme of that was to see what's there. Anyway, I found a lot of what is there, and so there's three things that I saw in the second quarter, so through the end of June. One was the true nature of the Oort Cloud in relation to the Galactic Tide. I'll get to that. The existence, or you could almost say a parallel existence, of an Ice Age civilization that was high tech, but instead of emphasizing, as we do today, air and fire, this civilization emphasized earth and water. And so it's very much like, you can probably see partial translation in the Lord of the Rings series, and also various stories of the Iroquois, for example. They're descended directly from this, you know, water and earth, in their philosophy of 7 generations, and also the Druids, of course. I'll get more to that later. And the third thing was, now get my cards out. Oh, yes, of course. I know I haven't had a couple of beers yet. I've had some coffee this morning, but yeah, I'm going to bring up that topic of reincarnation, past lives. So probably, you know, like now we're going to get back. I'm going to spin back to middle of February. I read The Field. Anyway, this book, one sentence summary, is that, you know, the overall density of the universe is equal. If you think that something is not there, it's really, there's dark matter that makes up for it. So it's like a yin-yang situation. So at the center of a black hole is like this, you know, like massively dense particle of what we would call matter. And so it's light, you know, it's easily detected, you know, it's like detected by this extreme gravity. So it's ironic that it's just like the yin-yang symbol, that in the middle of the light is this dark, and then in the middle of the dark is the light. And so everything is like equal density. If it's like less density, it's not nothing there, but it's really, you know, like dark matter. And just because you can't perceive it doesn't mean something's not there. Let's just take everyday examples. I realize it's really kind of freaky. And if you're this far in this video and still watching, you're realizing that, well, you have a high tolerance for what would be perceived as a load of crap, but I don't think that's true. Anyway, everyday examples. Okay, so you're in your car and you don't really feel any wind resistance when you're driving, especially if you're not in a convertible or something. You're just driving. You might feel a lot of resistance from everybody else driving. You know, it's like the more people that are driving, the worse it gets. Even when you're walking, you don't really feel anything. Walking's great. Nothing wrong with it. But get on a bike, and even if there is no wind, you're going to feel the wind. Okay, see, there's something there. Okay, so where am I at here? Oh, yes. Okay. So I found out about this book, Reality is Not What It Seems. And what is really mind-blowing about this is that, you know, it's a book on physics, and the Journey to Quantum Gravity, Carlo Rovelli. Highly recommended it. I put it on hold the last week of June. Anyway, I picked it up July 3rd from the Milwaukee's Library. And anyway, lots of cool stuff in here. One thing that's interesting about this book is that as a physics book, it has a Dewey Decimal number of 530, okay? If you, it's one thing I noticed that the author uses the word intuition. This book really, by the amount of times that you do like a similar to a DNA search, you know, for certain, you know, codon or certain gene, it would just say intuition is a gene. This book should have a Dewey Decimal number in the 130s. Okay, you can Google that if you want. Anyway, lots of cool stuff in here. I'll point out to page 36. He discusses how there was a lot of knowledge that was preserved and translated by Florences Bibliotheca Laurentia. Anyway, as I said, I picked up this book July 3rd. I had a blog post about a secret garden where there are goats that are grazing in the trees in Morocco. That's going to be significant a little bit later. Anyway, you know, and I referred to Renaissance libraries, and Florences Library is one of them that I brought up. Anyway, there's lots of other cool accents on this particular page, and it's kind of like it's art that asks you out. Now, I didn't come up with that clever turn of phrase. I have to give credit where its credit is due. New York Times, that's on June 30th. Normally, I read the paper at lunch or look through it, but that day I got an intuitive hit to look at the paper before I got my morning coffee, and certainly before I read any email that particular day. So anyway, back to that book. So when Rovelli's discussing the nature of, it's almost like a history book. He talks about at first there were what was the physics of the classical world, and how, you know, go through Galileo, Newton, of course Einstein, and all the other scientists that had developed quantum physics, and realized that, you know, there was some kind of disparity between, well, read the book, but it seemed like the theories, even though all the experiments worked perfectly for both theories, the theories seem contradictory to each other. And then there's a new standard model that comes out, and part of it is what he called the spin foam nature of the universe. Spin foam, what's that? It's foam that's spinning, like soap bubbles spinning. Well, that's the nature of every particle of matter, is that, you know, we're all, everything is the nature of reality is a covariant quantum field. That's all there is. And if something is perceived as matter, it's a waveform that is monotonous, or more monotonous than what would be considered to be, you know, just a waveform. So the book is really deep, and I actually haven't finished it yet. There's still like the final chapter. I have to turn it in tomorrow because there's already a bunch of holds on it. People that read, I don't know. Anyway, oh yeah, I forgot about the New York Times. I realized that in the deep polarity of our age, of this time, that, you know, there's two differing opinions on the New York Times. It's either all the news that's fit to print, or to use a couple very big words, very fake news. As you can, I'm going to be referencing the New York Times. Deal with it. You you can always shut this off. Okay, so I went through now this Ice Age civilization. So all the way up until probably towards the end of the Ice Age, everybody's heard probably of Atlantis. Probably not quite as many people have heard of Lemuria. And, the theme is that there were two continents that sunk into the ocean and that these continents were opposed to each other. From what I found through my meditations in the Oort Cloud, now I could say meditations in the Oort Cloud, what do you mean by that? So the Oort Cloud is 2 light years away, but yet it's an interface, entropy-free interface with, across the galaxy. So it's irrelevant that it's only 2 light years away, that you get into the Oort Cloud and you can probably, however big the Milky Way is, that you can access all what Einstein called the extended present. So in other words, that like on Mars, for example, is 15 minutes away. Anything that occurs, you're in communication with someone on Mars. Anything that occurs in that 15-minute window is simultaneous. It's the extended present. Okay, so from what I got in my meditations in the Oort Cloud is that there wasn't like 2 separate civilizations that sank into the ocean, but pretty close. It was as I said, a high-tech civilization that emphasized water and earth, located in what is the Amazon rainforest today. So back during the Ice Age, the Amazon was not a rainforest. It was very much like the Serengeti. The Amazon River and its tributaries were still there, but it's a tropical wet and dry climate where, the water was abundant, but yet it had to be managed. And the people there, they emphasized water and earth. Now, of course, there were people that, like they were kind of like an oppressed minority group that said, hey, what about fire and air? We can, smelt metal, with using fire and air, a bellows and a blast furnace. But the elites of the civilization considered them crackpots and, part of, some occult religion. And, I know it's kind of hard to describe it. I mean, is there a parallel today? Well, yeah, we'll get to that. But anyway, the features of this tech civilization were that they were able to manage water and earth. And, there were causeways that not only allowed people to move entropy-free. You can see this. There was an article in the UK Guardian. It's on, had 10 different bike paths, maps of the cities. I mean, bike paths in the cities are an entropy-free way of getting around. Just wait till August 21st in the Willamette Valley in Oregon, and you're going to know what you mean. Well, you'll understand exactly what I mean about entropy-free way of getting around on a bike, as opposed to a car or walking is really slow. So in the Amazon, there were these causeways and various locks that controlled the water that allowed for year-round agriculture of plants that needed water all the time, even though it was during the dry season, and during the wet season it was able to move that water out. And the evidence of this is actually right in our faces. In the city of Tenochtitlan, where Mexico City exists today, when the Spaniards, they were completely amazed at this city, because in this high desert plateau is this lake, and this lake is naturally brackish. It's like almost like the Salton Sea or something like that. But yet, where Tenochtitlan was, they had the inhabitants the Aztecs had separated out. There was fresh water in the city itself, and there were, like the causeways, and they moved by canoe. The elite lived in the central city, and if it was brackish, no one would want to live next to some, like fetid swamp, or where it was just smelling and nasty and everything. So they had moved it out, and this was a warlike race or warlike people. I mean, they did massive, they were the warrior manifestation of the Maya, who were very similar. But there's no way that they would just, like spontaneously build the city that it was probably and would still be a wonder of the world. It puts, Venice is nothing compared to this. Anyway, so that's the evidence. I mean, where do they get this? So, and the other evidence is the existence of terra preta. It's extremely fertile soil in spots of the Amazon rainforest. Normally right now, because of the torrential rains, the soil and the trees, and whenever the tree falls, it goes into the river, and there's so much flow, it just, all the minerals and everything just get brought out to the Atlantic. It's gone. So normally, most of the rainforest soil is not very good, but there's areas where it's feet deep, and it is man-made, or it's human-made. And the reason why is because the evidence of it, like there's the basic formations of NPK, except that it comes from, like actual human burning of, and it's not the natural topsoil that's present or used to be present in Iowa. Iowa had 9 feet of topsoil, and that didn't come from the buffalo. It came from the woolly mammoths and the mastodons that grazed there. And that's a significant impact as to what happened to this Amazonian civilization that emphasized the feminine qualities of water and earth. So, it was just like today, like back then, except that, and there were, it was the elites, even though they had, the best interests of the people at heart, became very insular. And evidence of this is in how the Druids were. That the Celts had the Druids, and it was a high priest class. But the issue was that to become a Druid, it wasn't just, like, hey, I'm just going to spend a couple summers or something like that, or maybe in the wintertime, donning some robes and harvesting some herbs and going to Stonehenge. But no, it was an 18-year training. So, I mean, it's just like today. If, you have, everybody wants their children to be successful, if only, especially financially successful, only if so they can stop working, live off your kids. Same thing back then. And so everybody would have wanted their kids to be Druids, right? But can you sacrifice 18 years of labor for this? I mean, it's just like today, like you send your kid to, like the prep preschool, like high tuition for preschool, and then you get into a special grade school, and then a special high school where they're just training to get, 1,500 on the SATs, and then you get into Ivy League school. I mean, the amount of money and time spent is like $1 million. How many people have that kind of money? Just a very small percentage of the population. And so even though it's on the surface, it's a meritocracy, we know it's not. So, but of course there were, elements within the society that were dissatisfied, and they used the very tools. They conjured up a comet that slammed into the Laurentine ice sheet, probably about 13,000 years ago. And this melding of ice and rock, water and earth, when it slammed into the ice sheet at 50,000 miles per hour, it wasn't just this gradual melting or something like that. This, it manifested the very qualities of air and fire. This ice and rock became vaporized into pressurized steam that basically ignited whatever, like tundra or whatever vegetation that was left in North America. And while it didn't cause the fall of this Amazonian civilization, it definitely destabilized it. It caused increased conflicts, and what happened was that there was this diaspora of, like people just left. And so a lot of people left. They eventually settled. Some people stayed in the Amazon for a while. It was still pretty good, but they left. Some people went to, especially the Atlanteans, they went to Europe or went to North Africa, and they found the Nile. And at February 5th, I'm going to reference New York Times article, "Seduced by the Past." It's in the travel section about the Knights Templar, how they built the French district, the Parisian district, the Morass, which, because at that time it was a marsh, but once the Knights Templar built it up, then the church went in. And the thing is about the Knights Templar, they had some kind of knowledge that they had gotten from Egypt. And so this is where I'm going to go back to Egypt. If you want to read about the Knights Templar, read the February 5th. Actually, I think, I published it February 9th. So anyway, so the Nile, these Atlanteans, they settled in the Nile. They saw, actually at that time, there wasn't the Sahara, but they saw an opportunity. Oh, more New York Times article. This was today. Disappearance of fertile land fuels looming crisis in Africa. So the Serengeti was, I almost think that the New York Times for me is like a deck of Lenormand cards. It's just, I haven't even looked at the paper yet today. I mean, if I wanted this video to be about another 15 minutes, I would go through the Sunday Review. I'd find plenty of stuff. So anyway, at that time, the Sahara was fertile, absolutely beautiful. But these Atlanteans, they knew how to control people. And they encouraged them to, hey, you should increase your flocks, and, we're going to help you, increase your flocks, you get more, they had some toys with them. And anyway, the Sahara dried up. And it wasn't that they just wanted to control what was these, indigenous North Africans, but also they wanted to control what was going on in the Western Hemisphere. So when the Sahara dried up, all these lakes, which had, abundant fisheries, and, they dried up. And so what happens now, what is happening now, is that there's 15 million tons of phosphorus dust that flows across the Atlantic and seeds the clouds in the Amazon. And so instead of it being a tropical wet and dry, it's now a tropical wet forest that basically whatever was there 5,000 years ago sank into the waters of the Amazon. So yes, this continent sank. Okay, so now, the Sahara's dried up. These Atlanteans, they got these people under their thumb. They have them build pyramids, but it's a very, they have some really, like profound knowledge. They know how to control the Nile, so it's amazingly productive. The people that built the pyramids, they weren't slaves. They were highly paid craftsmen, and they had families, and so they willingly did this because they were prosperous. They actually, there was an issue with that they weren't getting the regular allotment of course they had beer. I mean, that's where beer came from. But they weren't getting their regular allotment of onions and garlic and dates, and so they went on strike, and the government had to give them a pay raise. So this got started with the classical civilizations in the Mediterranean, and so it wasn't just the Nile. These Atlanteans, they actually did enjoy themselves for a while on Crete, but then Mount Thera exploded and wiped out, that core elite, and also sending a tsunami over, which allowed a particular fractious tribe of, ne'er-do-well, non-team players that didn't want to play by the rules, but they left and settled somewhere northeast. And so, but there was also some Lemurian folk that had crossed over. Of course, there were the Druids, but also the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians, so they're known, they settled in Lebanon, or what's now known as Lebanon today, and they built a trading network. They didn't really deal with war very much, but they had the seashells, the purple dye, and they wove cloths. Weaving is definitely something that is more oriented towards water and earth. You have underwater basket weaving, but really, I'm not disparaging at all. When the Spaniards came over and conquered the Inca, they had the plate armor on, but they saw that they had like this, the Inca, they had these, it's like a mesh armor that was actually more effective. It was more flexible, lighter, and it was more effective than the plate armor. And so they actually just ditched the plate armor and wore that stuff. But from the Phoenicians and the Trojans, there were two divergent civilizations, and both of which could have dominated. One of them did dominate the Mediterranean. There was Rome, and then there was the Carthaginians. Now, Carthage was founded by Queen Dido, and so she was from Phoenicia, and when she landed, or when her people landed in what's now Tunisia, Tunis, there were already the Numidians, and they are, a warlike race, and but she, it's like there's no white flag for Dido. She knew what she was doing, and all too well. And so these, the Berbers or the Numidians, they said, okay, you can have some land, just enough that, of which that you can get an ox hide around. Okay, so they're thinking they're going to give up a couple acres, but look, it's Phoenicians, they're weavers, they got a pretty long thread going, and but they were able to convince the Carthaginians were able to convince the Numidians to join their side, and so that's why you had the Hannibal and the elephants and everything. And that's another thing. The Romans, were like the manifestation of Atlantis, and part of it was their absolute disdain for the Carthaginians. And it's interesting that the conflict centered in the area of Hispania. That's where that conflict was. At that time, it was just a bunch of, an offshoot of the Celts. They, weren't really doing anything. But, the Romans trained those people pretty well after they had dispatched the Carthaginians. Now I'm going to get back to, the Romans. They pretty much tolerated all religions. You had to try really hard to, as a Christian, to get yourself a place in the Colosseum. And usually you had to be a psychopath to get there, to be there. But they hated the Druids, absolutely. I mean, probably even more so than the Carthaginians. And so the Druids were cornered on the Isle of Anglesey, and they were slaughtered. And so now this is where I'm going to be transitioning to, that topic that I had alluded to earlier, reincarnation. I was there at Anglesey as a Druid, and it was just absolutely heartbreaking as everybody was wiped out. And, I promised myself never again. And so, I didn't realize the cost at that time, but, it was probably perhaps part of my soul's journey. But I had to become, like the Romans. So at first, it's like it was kind of easy. Like I probably had a few incarnations as, like the Germanic guerrilla fighters against the Roman occupation. Probably, maybe even in the Goths, when the Goths were fleeing the Huns and they were supposedly given sanctuary as immigrants, but then they were deceived by the Roman officials, and so of course they turned and ended up sacking Rome. Very satisfying sack, by the way. But it's like these it kept getting tighter and tighter. I did have what would be termed rebound or kind of buffer reincarnations here in the Pacific Northwest. I'll discuss that in a moment. And so it kept getting tighter and tighter to a point where, I've had 3 very recent incarnations in which that there's evidence in 3D. And one of them, he had penned a note to saying that he wished he had a do-over, even though he had all this, success as a military officer. So, and I know this is not a buffer life because I know 2 times that where I could have bailed out and had a rebound or a buffer life, but that debt's been paid. Anyway, back to like the reason why I feel that this is a buffer life, and yet not a buffer life, but that I've paid my karmic debt, and yet I need to use what I have learned as a warrior, as that. And this is yesterday in the New York Times. Again, I'm not on the fake news side on this one. Power struggle is taking shape on this mighty river, the Columbia River. And anyway, the tone of the article, it's all about hydroelectricity and how the current administration wants to privatize the Bonneville Power Administration. And it kind of, they always start, like small, say, no, it's not the dams, it's not the actual resources, but it's just the transmission lines. And we know how that goes. Okay. This cannot happen. This cannot happen. BPA, the region, the Cascadia region needs to step up, and they need to regionalize this. They need to float a bond issue, British Columbia, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and I don't want to include California. They're a very greedy state. They will take, if they had a chance, they will reroute the Willamette River, send it southward. And anyway, they need water. So yeah, it's not about electricity, it's about water. And if we're talking about, Nestle at Cascade Locks, that's nothing compared to what could happen here. It's very important that the Bonneville Power Administration stay in the hands of, and we will take up arms if necessary. Anyway, I know this video is really long. Anyway, thank you for watching.